Hey guys, what's going on? So today we're going to be going over how to install a Linux distribution using Qemu on a Windows host. It'll be pretty straightforward, but let's dive into it. Alright, so first off, we want to pretty much download Manjaro. You can go to manjaro.org and pick which desktop environment that you want to use. I'm going to go with KDE Plasma, and I've already downloaded that. So once you've done that, we'll go ahead and we'll take a look at the arguments for using Qemu. So essentially when we're using Qemu, and what I'm doing here, by the way, is I'm going to be doing this through Cygwin. So it's going to be actually using Bash as my shell instead of using DOS. So the format, if you're using Windows, will not look exactly like this. Instead, you're going to want to go to the same folder that you installed Qemu in. And by the way, you can get Qemu. You can download Qemu from qemu.org and install it on Windows or Mac or whatever you have, right? Whatever operating system you have. Today we're going to be doing this on a Windows host. But yeah, so the arguments that we're going to be using for Qemu is you're going to want to have, let me fix this real quick here. The first one is your CD-ROM, which is going to point to your ISO that you just downloaded. In my case, it's KDE. I have it here on my F drive. The second one is the boot menu. Turn the boot menu on so that you can actually select the boot from the CD-ROM. You can change the boot order if you want. There's a different argument for that, but I just usually leave the boot menu on. Third one here is going to point to your image file, which I'm going to go over creating in just a minute here. You don't necessarily need these bottom ones. It's just kind of for performance reasons, and I'll go over those a little bit more in depth later. I do need to point out you will need this one actually. This one right here, this netnic, the tapnet. There's multiple ways you can set up your network connection. Actually, you don't necessarily need this, to be honest. If you're just doing a base install, you don't need network connection just to be able to install it. But if you do want to set up a tap network, you're going to actually need OpenVPN for that. If you install OpenVPN, it'll actually install this adapter right here called TAP Windows Adapter version 9 for OpenVPN. And once it does that, you can actually utilize this to make a NAT network. And from there, you'll be able to access the internet. So getting right into it, right? So now that we have our ISO, let's go ahead and make the image that we're going to need right here. Manjaro.image. You can name it whatever you want. It doesn't have to be Manjaro.image. That's just what I named it because I've been playing around with a bunch of different distros. In order to do that, you have to go to your Qemu installation location. For me, it's on Program Files, Qemu. And in here, we're going to use Qemu image. And we're going to do create. We're going to say the format is qcal2. It's pretty much standard when it comes to Linux file system based hard disks. It's very good for expansion. And I would just recommend using that one. I mean, you can go with RAW. RAW is pretty good and very performant, but it doesn't really lend you the ability to do expansion. It's going to pre-allocate all of the space that you're going to end up using. So if you're going to be using 100 gigs, you're going to be sitting with a 100 gig file on your computer right off the bat, essentially. Let's see, for the output, let's do a cluster size of 2 megs, and we're going to call it, we're putting it here, VMs, Manjaro, Manjaro.image, and I want it to be 100 gigs. How about that? Alright, so now we have our image file. So now that we have our image file and we have our ISO, let's go ahead and launch Qemu so that we can get in and install the operating system. So I've gone through the command line that I'm going to pretty much use for that. So this is pretty much the same thing that I have up there. Slightly different, but don't worry about it. And I'm going to go ahead and run this, and it's going to launch into Qemu. Hit that boot menu, and then we'll load from DVD. And right off the bat, we get the Manjaro bootloader. I'm going to change this to America, do New York, boot with open source drivers. And actually there's, so we'll actually add a couple, well, one more set of arguments to go along with this when we boot into it. That way it looks a little bit better. But for now, we don't really need it. We can use the standard VGA, which is the default for launching Qemu. And there it goes, just being a little bit slow. And this is actually a little bit of a bug. There it goes. Now the BIOS are actually posting. Alright, so we're going to wait for this to finish, and we should be in the installer. Come on now. There we go. Alright, I'm going to run through how I essentially do an installation, and this may vary for you depending on how you want to do your installation. I like to split out the partitions onto a GPT. Custom GPT. I don't really like the way that they do it out the box. They pretty much only do 2 separate types, and we don't really need the internet anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Right, we'll look at that later. For the time being, let's see. I'm gonna go with the manual partition here. Yeah, that's fine. And we will do a new partition table. I'm gonna do a GUID partition table. And I'm gonna hit OK. So from this free space, now I'm gonna create my different partitions. And like I said, the way I like to set it up is a little different. Maybe I like to do 128 megs for my boot partition. We're gonna put that on boot. I'm gonna say BIOS GRUB boot. This won't really matter because the way I'm doing it, I don't want a master boot record. I just want to do it the old school BIOS, the old school legacy boot way essentially. So we're just gonna do it this way. If I put legacy boot, the installation still doesn't work with Manjaro. They just don't really support the combination that I'm doing, so I kind of have to do it myself. So, but for now, we're gonna go with this, right? So we got our 128 boot sector here. We're gonna go ahead and create another section for swap space. Let's just give it 6 gigs. And I'm gonna make that a Linux swap. Go down, give it the swap flag. Hit OK. Now we're going to create our root. I typically give this about 20 gigs. 20 gigs of space for root. Let's see. That's the mount point is the root. Give it the root flag. And then last but not least, we have the remaining space, which is going to be our home. Can you go away, please? I typically do LVM for that. I don't think they really even like honor these flags, to be honest. We can actually take a look at that once it's done. It's very interesting. I've noticed they kind of do some random stuff, even though you set the flags yourself. They just don't really honor them. It's very interesting. And I'm going to install my bootloader, obviously, on my boot partition. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next. It's going to say, hey, guess what? You need something with the BIOS GRUB flag enabled on an 8 megabyte unformatted partition. And let me tell you this right now, this doesn't work either. I've tried this as well. I've tried creating an 8 megabyte unformatted partition with the BIOS GRUB flag. It still doesn't work properly, so, I don't know. They'll probably never fix that. So we're just going to call this tester. It doesn't really matter. His name is pretty crazy. We're going to call it tester Manjaro Linux. Give it a good password here. And make it the same as the admin count. It doesn't really matter. I don't want any off the suite. That'll just slow us down anyway. And this is going to break down essentially what we're doing, right? So we have a GPT partition table on dev SDA, which is our Qemu hard disk. Got that 128 meg boot partition. What I said, now keep this in mind. I said I want it to be boot in BIOS GRUB. Like I said, we're going to take a look at this once this is finished. It's not going to be the case. Watch. Linux swap as swap only, and then ext4 partition as root. The flags are just gone now all of a sudden. Doesn't really matter, right? So that's pretty much what we're gonna do. Basically, what we just did in the setup is what it's gonna do. So let's go ahead and install that. And that's pretty much it for this part. I'm gonna step away and let this install, and then we'll come back and take a look at how it's doing. All right. And we're back, and it's all done installing. So like I said, I was going to go ahead and actually show you what ends up happening once you run their installer. It's pretty interesting. Go ahead and open up Parted. we'll print out. This is what they did, right? So they said legacy boot, and for some unknown reason, they're putting legacy boot on the swap as well. Not really sure why they're doing that. Doesn't really make sense to me. Legacy boot is fine, and it's interesting that they actually figured that out. That's actually kind of correct. But let's go ahead and actually remove set to legacy boot. Let's remove that from the swap, because we don't want that, obviously. Doesn't really matter though. Right, so now we have it set up kind of correctly, how it should be, essentially. And we can actually set on one. Here's something interesting, right? I'll set BIOS GRUB on 1 and print it, and it looks good, right? So I think we're good with that, right? Let's go ahead and exit, or sorry, quit, and exit. And here I'm going to show you something interesting. Doing this by default, like I said, is not going to work, right? I'm going to go ahead and show you that, right? So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this, close Qemu, and we're going to launch it again here. And go ahead and pick one for the hard disk, but it's just going to sit here. It's not actually going to work. And it's just going to get stuck booting the hard disk because it can't actually find the boot device. Very interesting. If you have this issue, don't worry, you can easily fix this. And I'm going to do that right now, actually. Because the reason that they're doing it is that they just don't support the way that I'm doing it. They want to actually kind of have you have a MBR. I would go with the MBR if you're new to Linux and you don't really know what you're doing. But since, you know, I'm not new, I kind of have a good experience with it. I kind of know that I want it this way, and I'm fine with that. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to fix that real quick. So we're going to go ahead and launch it again. But this time go back into the... whoops, I pressed the wrong button there. Go back into the ISO. Right, so hit 4. And let's see. Yeah, we don't really care. We're just going to boot in real quick and then have access to terminal so that we can fix it. And it's actually fairly straightforward. Essentially, you just have to rebuild the GRUB configuration and reinstall GRUB, and you're good to go. Not sure what they're doing exactly when they install GRUB, but it just doesn't set it up properly. But, you know, I tried digging into that to see what exactly was happening. I spent too much time on it and didn't exactly figure it out. But at the end of the day, if you go read their wiki about installation and their support for those versus UEFI, you'll see that they don't really support the way I'm doing it, which is like legacy boot BIOS and without a master boot record. All right, so now that we're here, if we want to fix it, what we're going to do is use Manjaro chroot -a. That way it'll automatically mount for us. All right, so now we have that mounted. Let's just reinstall GRUB. That's all we're going to do here. We're going to force it. We're going to say the target is what is it? i386-PC. Tell it to recheck. The boot directory is /boot, and that is on dev SDA, right? So the other option is if you're doing a UEFI installation, the target would be x86_64-EFI, and it would be EFI directory instead. And typically you would install that on /boot/EFI. So if you're doing that way, just keep that in mind. And you will need a proper EFI to point to once you're done with this and the Qemu arguments if you're going to actually use UEFI. I wish this would stop popping up. And once that's done, now we're going to remake the GRUB configuration. So we're going to do grub config o/boot grub.cfg. You don't actually have to do this GRUB make config. I believe it actually does it as part of the installation anyway, but I like to do it just for sanity's sake. Actually, no, I don't think it does do it in the GRUB install, but I always do this just for sanity's sake. You don't have to do this. It works just fine if you just do a reinstall of grub. And that's actually it. That just fixes it for us right off the bat. We can go ahead and exit this whole thing. And we're gonna tweak these we're gonna tweak this real quick now. So now we don't need this anymore. Essentially, we don't need the boot menu. You guys can go ahead and add the rest of it now this now if you want. And the one extra thing we're gonna add here, and it's just gonna make it a little bit faster, right? We're gonna say VGA VirtIO. And that's gonna tell to use VirtIO instead of the standard VGA. It's gonna be a little bit more smooth. And you know, you'll see. I'm gonna go ahead and add that now to mine and clean this up a little bit. So we're gonna get rid of, fix this. This should be HDA, and then get rid of everything in the front here. Essentially, we don't need the CD-ROM anymore. We don't need file equals if we're doing it HDA. And we're gonna go ahead and add VGA VirtIO. And if you want, you can actually put your specific CPU model. If you're using Mac as a host or Linux already as a host, then just do CPU host. If you happen to know what your CPU is, you can do, or what CPU model you're using. Like in my case, I'm using a Broadwell. I'm going to go ahead and do CPU dash CPU Broadwell. And it should make it actually understand that, hey, I'm using a Broadwell CPU. What is this? Unexpected VP exit code. You know what? Alright, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. I ended up having to disable and re-enable the Hyper-V features in Windows and restarting the computer. And to get the tap adapter to work properly, I had to disable it and re-enable it after restarting the computer as well. I'm not sure what was going on with Windows, but it's good now. We're going to go ahead and skip to where I've got this all working and move on from there. Alright. That should be it. Go ahead and launch it. From hard disk, and we should be good to go. Let's see. There we are. We are in our operating system. Now, since I made it VGA VirtIO, that means that I can actually go full screen and it'll automatically resize all the windows and the desktop for us. That's basically why we're doing it. So, see how this is kind of like smashed and big. Make it bigger here. I went ahead and fixed the connection issue. Now that we're here, let's take a look at how fast things run. Right, it's pretty smooth, right? Not too bad. New kernel available, blah blah blah. So we're running fairly quickly. All right, now that we've got Firefox open, let's go ahead and launch a video here. Check out how the quality is going to be. Typically, videos played in a virtual machine, especially if you're using the default graphics adapter, it's going to be pretty poor quality. It's going to be choppy and slow and not very good. And you can hear the audios coming through for the video. That's because of the last BM option that I have there for Qemu. And like I said, I'll go over those a little bit later. But as you can see, it's not choppy at all, actually. It's working fairly well. Skip ahead here a little bit. It's not a lot of action going on, but I mean, either way, you would see choppy video if you go and check out the default standard VGA driver, which is I believe called STD standard. But yeah, looks pretty nice. Very good quality. No issues at all here, actually. Everything seems to be loading fairly quickly. Even the previews are not having any issues. No lagginess at all. For comparison here, essentially, I've run the same setup in a virtual machine, and it was very choppy, very laggy. Lots of frame rate issues. But this so far is very good here with using Qemu. So very nice. Pretty much it. But I mean, it's looking fairly stable and fairly quick, to be honest. It's very nice. I'm not seeing pretty much any lag. Let's open up Dolphin. Very quick. Even moving around the file manager here. It's very smooth, a lot smoother than I was expecting actually. Go in here, just kind of flip around real quick, do some quick moving through locations here. Yeah, very smooth, very quick transition, no lag at all. Very nice. So far, this is at the top of the list. I'm liking this a lot. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, this is all you need to do. And as you can see, we already have Manjaro running here on using Qemu. That's why it's called Qemu, right? Quick emulation. Yeah, let me actually go over these. I haven't done that yet, right? So this is the accelerator, right? So we're basically saying use the Windows hypervisor accelerator in this case. That way we can actually have hypervisor support to easily accelerate the use of like the virtual CPU and the memory and the underlying direct IO using the virtualization options that you can enable in your BIOS. As you can see, it made it for an extremely smooth experience. The other alternative is HacksM, and you can do that. You can use that as well if you want. You just put Excel hacks. I've tested both of these, and while hacks is pretty good. I used to use hacks. It used to actually be a lot better than WHPX, which is the Windows hypervisor. This is provided by Intel. Used to be a lot better, but Windows has come a long way as far as hypervisor support, and I would definitely say WHPX is a lot better now than hacks. So I definitely recommend WHPX. And just double check here, I did go over how do you access that. You just go to turn Windows features on or off. Come down here, you can just check the Hyper-V box. It'll go ahead and turn all this stuff on. You don't need the management tools. This is going to be for actually what we're going to go over next is using Windows Hyper-V to test if you want to run a virtual machine through Windows hypervisor manager, then you can turn on the other options here. But we really just need the platform. So this is the actual hypervisor and the services. You can also turn on down here Windows Hypervisor Platform, which enables the software to run. And that's pretty much all you have to do. Once you turn those on, you'll have to restart the computer, and then you can use the acceleration for it. Other than that, the USB device, USB tablet, basically makes it so that when the Qemu window comes up, I don't have to deal with the cursor essentially not matching my cursor when I actually bring it into that window. But what ends up happening is if you don't put this, the cursor doesn't properly line up. So like you're saying you're trying to click something and you think you have your cursor over it, but in fact you don't, because what happens is you go outside the window and the way the grab works, it doesn't necessarily keep it in the window. So it won't have the cursor perfectly lined up where you think it is. So just doing this makes it a lot smoother for transitioning between the window and your actual desktop environment, your host desktop environment, I should say. And show cursor is not necessary. It actually just overlays your host cursor on top of the virtual machine's cursor. It's just that I just do that so that's easier to show you guys where I'm actually clicking. You don't necessarily need this. This is saying I want you to use 3 CPUs, 3 virtual CPUs. I have 6. The standard recommendation is you want to take how many threads you have and divide it by 2 essentially. So if you have like 6 cores, I have 6 cores. I'm dividing that by 2. That gives me 3 cores to work with. This is pretty straightforward. How much memory I want the virtual machine to have. I want to have 8 gigs. This I went over. This is just saying NetNIC. Use my NIC card for network, and make sure to use the tap interface. And again, it's called local area connection. You can go in here. You can rename it to whatever you want. I'm just leaving it local area connection for now. It doesn't really matter. These are not necessary really. It's just kind of artifact that I've had left over. I was using this before when I was playing around with download scripts. And the last one is the sound for the audio to come through the VM, which I went over a little bit earlier. If you want to if you don't really know what device you have, you can also do sound HW all. it'll say it's deprecated, but it'll still work just fine. It'll go ahead and load all the different drivers they support, and it'll work just fine that way as well. Alright, that wraps up how to set up pretty much any Linux distribution using Quick Emulator on Windows as a host. You can go to the wiki or not the wiki, but the documentation for Qemu and figure out what other VM arguments they have, and you can play around with them, such as different video drivers, or if you want to try out a different network connection type like a bridge, or the typical default one would be a user network. Give them a go, play around with it, and see what you can figure out. Let me know if you can figure out any other nice tweaks to get it to work very well in Windows, because it was very much of a surprise how well it actually worked for me. And I'm gonna be using this going forward. That's pretty much it, guys. I'll catch you in the next video.